All right, so we're diving into the Canterbury Tales today, a work that's like, what, over 600 years old?
Yeah, late 14th century.
And this deep dive is all about like pulling out those super interesting pieces from this medieval masterpiece, and trying to figure out why it still matters to us now.
Yeah, why it still resonates.
We've got info on the historical stuff, the author, the story itself, and why it's important in literature. So think of this as like your cheat sheet to understanding the lasting power of Chaucer's work.
Definitely. And to really get the Canterbury Tales, you got to see the world through the author's eyes,
Right, put yourself in his shoes.
Exactly. So Geoffrey Chaucer, he lived roughly from 1340 to 1400.
Okay, so good long life.
Yeah, and he's often called the father of English literature.
I've heard that before.
And he wasn't just some, bookworm shut away in a tower.
Okay.
He was a Londoner through and through. He lived life to the fullest. Born into a well-off family, his dad was a wine merchant. Right, but he didn't just follow in his dad's footsteps. Oh no, he was a page, a soldier, even a diplomat. And get this, he also held jobs like controller of customs and justice of the peace.
Wow, what a resume.
I know, right? All these experiences, they definitely shaped his writing. You could see it in his work. And what's really cool is that he started the Canterbury Tales in Middle English.
Middle English, that's
It's the form of English they were speaking in England from like 1150 to 1500. So a big chunk of time.
Okay, got it.
So he started around 1387 and spent about 13 years on it. But here's the thing, he died before he could finish it.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, he had big plans for it.
It's amazing, though, to think about this guy living back then in the late 1300s. What were some of the big things happening in society that might have influenced his work?
Well, the Catholic Church was a huge deal back then. I mean, it had its fingers in everything across Europe.
Right, everyone was Catholic, pretty much.
Pretty much. But there was this new group starting to make waves, the merchant class.
Like shopkeepers and traders and such.
Yeah, exactly. And they were starting to challenge the old ways, the traditional feudal system.
So we're like shaking things up a bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that tension between the church and these new money folks, it's important to keep that in mind as we look closer at the tales themselves.
Okay, good point. So let's get to the heart of it. What exactly is the Canterbury Tales about? What's the story?
All right, picture this. 29 people, all different backgrounds, all walks of life. They meet up at this inn, the Tabard Inn in Southwark, which is just outside London.
Okay.
And they're all going to the same place, the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral.
Like a religious pilgrimage?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A medieval road trip with a spiritual purpose.
I like that. A medieval road trip.
And the way the story's told, it's called a frame narrative. The pilgrimage is the frame, the big picture. And within that frame, the pilgrims entertain each other on the journey by telling stories.
Oh, that's cool. I get it. So the pilgrimage is happening and they're telling stories along the way.
You got it. Chaucer's original plan was massive. He wanted each pilgrim to tell 2 stories on the way there and 2 on the way back.
Wow, ambitious.
For sure. But like we said, he didn't live long enough to finish it all.
So we've got this group of different people on a pilgrimage telling stories to each other. How did that shake things up in the world of literature back then?
Oh, this is where it gets juicy.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about passing the time. There was actually a competition going on.
A competition?
Yeah. The guy running the Tabard Inn, he says, whoever tells the best story gets a free meal when they get back.
Nice incentive.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're all trying to outdo each other. But here's the thing that's really important. These stories, they give us this incredible peek into medieval England.
Like a time capsule?
Totally. You see their social lives, their values, everything. You meet everyone, a noble knight, a smart clerk, a loud miller, a worldly wife of Bath. Like every corner of society is represented.
That's really cool. So a real mix of characters.
And the stories they tell, they reflect that, you have the Knight's Tale, all about chivalry, and then the Miller's Tale, which is way more down to earth and, a little crude.
So it's giving us the full spectrum of society back then.
Exactly.
And you mentioned earlier that Chaucer wrote in English. That was kind of a big deal, right?
Huge.
Yeah.
At that time, the big languages in Europe were Latin for the church and scholars and French for the fancy folks at court.
Makes sense.
But Chaucer, he chose to write this huge work in English, like the everyday language people spoke. It was a game changer.
Yeah, bringing literature to the people.
Exactly. And it had a massive impact. Later writers like Shakespeare, they owe a lot to Chaucer. And, there are over 80 handwritten copies of the Canterbury Tales that survived just from the 1400s.
Wow, so people were really into it.
Oh, yeah, it was a hit.
Okay.
So it was a big deal that he wrote it in English, really helped make English a major language for literature.
That makes me wonder, what kind of things did Chaucer write about? Were they all, religious stories fitting for a pilgrimage?
Not a chance. He wasn't afraid to put some buttons.
Like what?
Well, he talks about corruption in the church a lot. They're amongst friars, a partner in the group, and he doesn't paint them in a very flattering light.
Not exactly saints, then.
Not quite. More like interested in money and worldly pleasures than, spiritual stuff.
Hypocrites.
You could say that. But to be fair, he also shows us good religious figures, like the parson who is humble and sincere.
So it's a balanced view then.
Yeah, he's not just bashing the whole church, just showing us how complicated it was.
Makes sense. Like in the general prologue, he describes the friar as being way more into making money than, actually helping people spiritually.
Right. A sharp critique there. And then there's the partner's tale, which is super interesting because on the surface, it's all about being against greed, but the partner himself is totally corrupt.
Wow. So that's like an extra layer of commentary there.
Exactly. Chaucer was a master at that kind of stuff.
So we've talked about the church. What else did Chaucer explore in his stories?
Gender roles were a big one. He shows us the lives of nuns. And then there's the wife of Bath. She's a really fascinating character.
How so?
Well, she's strong, outspoken, and she has some pretty radical ideas about marriage and women's place in society.
So ahead of her time.
Definitely. Her prologue is like a whole conversation about marriage, female agency, even how to interpret the Bible when it comes to gender. That's really something.
Wow, I'll have to check that out. What about social class? Did Chaucer touch on that?
Oh, yeah, big time. The whole setup of the pilgrimage with people from all different classes interacting that highlights the social inequalities of the time. And the stories themselves, they reflect the teller's social standing. A knight's tale is going to be different from a miller's tale.
Right, different perspectives.
And then there's the whole question of relationships, the knight's tale, the wife of Bath's tale. They both dive into love, marriage, and power struggles between men and women. And let me tell you, some of it is pretty cynical.
Human nature never changes, I guess.
I guess not.
So out of all of this, what stands out to you the most about the Canterbury Tales?
What gets me is how Chaucer created this whole world with the pilgrimage as the backbone, and then he fills it with all these individual stories, each one reflecting the person telling it. It's genius.
He's like weaving a tapestry.
Totally. He's giving us a journey and a portrait of medieval life at the same time, with all the good and the bad.
All right, so wrapping things up, why should we care about these stories in the 21st century? Why does a book written over 600 years ago in a form of English, most of us don't speak, matter to us now?
It matters because this was a turning point in English literature. This was Chaucer breaking new ground with language storytelling and social commentary. It wasn't just him spinning yarns. It was a reflection of his whole world.
So it was like a window into the past.
Exactly. We see their beliefs, their struggles, their triumphs. And guess what? A lot of it still feels relevant today.
Because people are people.
Exactly.
So for everyone listening, engaging with the Canterbury Tales, it's not just about history. It's about seeing how stories have always been a way for us to explore society, to understand ourselves, and just to be entertained.
It might even make you want to read some of the tales for yourself. See how these characters from hundreds of years ago are still relatable today?
That's a great point. So much of what they dealt with is still relevant.
And here's a thought to leave you with. Chaucer showed us so many different perspectives through his pilgrims centuries ago. So how does that make us think about all the different voices and stories we hear in our own world today? A world that's full of information, sometimes too much information.
That's a really interesting question to think about.
It is. And maybe exploring one of the tales in more detail would be a good next step. Maybe the wife of Bath's tale or the partner's tale.
Yeah, that's a great idea for our listeners.
Really dig in and see what you discover.
Thanks for that. It's been great diving into the Canterbury Tales with you today.
My pleasure, anytime.